I used to think love could fix everything. That if you were loyal enough, patient enough, and honest enough, life would somehow reward you for it. But that's not how the world works. Not here. Not in America, where smiles are rehearsed and promises dissolve the moment something shinier comes along. My name's Ethan Cole. I'm 38. I work in logistics, spreadsheets, shipments, endless phone calls. A safe, quiet job. I used to wear the same navy suit every Monday, the same gray one every Tuesday. I thought stability meant success. I thought if I worked hard enough, my wife would see that I was building something for us. Her name was Lauren. We met in college. She studied marketing. I studied management. She was wild, ambitious, and I was steady, the kind of guy her parents liked because I seemed safe. I wasn't rich, but I was consistent. She used to call me her anchor. Now I realize anchors don't hold people in place. They drag them down. It started subtly. Late nights at work, a new perfume, more makeup, the phone flipped screen down on the table. I told myself it was nothing. Everyone gets busy, right? But then came the laughter, that kind of soft, secret laugh that didn't belong to me anymore. One night, I came home early. Her car wasn't in the driveway, though she'd said she was working from home. I sat in the kitchen, waiting. The clock ticked past 10, then 11. When she finally walked in, her lipstick was smudged, her blouse buttoned wrong. And when I asked her where she'd been, she smiled. That kind of smile that told me I didn't want to know the truth. It's not what you think, she said. But she never told me what it was. The next few weeks were hell. Every look, every silence was heavy. She started staying out more. I stopped asking questions, because every question was just another cut. You can only bleed so much before you go numb. Then came the text. It wasn't meant for me. It popped up on the screen while she was in the shower. Just one line. He's coolest. I'll be done with him soon. My hands went cold. My vision blurred. It wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation. I'd built my whole life around someone who saw me as a fool. That night, while she slept beside me, I sat in the dark, scrolling through her messages, her photos, her lies. The pieces clicked together, his name, his number, their hotel receipts. It was a coworker, someone from her office, someone she'd introduced to me once, smiling like it was nothing. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. I just sat there staring at the wall, and something inside me died quietly. For days I went through the motions, work, home, fake smiles. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends, not my family. Because who wants to admit that they've been played? That their wife was out there laughing with another man while they were paying her car insurance? But something else started to grow inside me. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was sharp, cold, focused. I started watching, listening. I noticed things I'd ignored before. The way she spoke when she lied. The way she touched her phone like it was her lifeline. I wasn't her husband anymore. I was her shadow. And for the first time in years, I felt awake. I realized something. Lauren didn't just cheat on me. She underestimated me. And that's the mistake she'll regret the most, because I might have been the fool once, but now I'm the man she should have never crossed. After that night, the world didn't look the same. It was sharper, colder. Every sound in the house echoed like a lie. Every glance from Lauren carried weight, like she was daring me to ask questions, to explode, to make it easy for her to leave. But I didn't. I just watched. And that scared her more than anger ever could. I stopped confronting. I started collecting. Her laptop, her phone, her planner. She thought I was too stupid to notice the small details, the password she recycled, the USB drives she left in her purse. But I learned. Every night, while she slept, I became someone else. Someone quieter, more dangerous. I found everything, the emails, the photos, even the reservations under fake names. She wasn't meeting him once or twice. It had been going on for almost a year, and I'd been paying for everything. The dinners, the vacations, the car she drove to meet him. The joke was cosmic. I was the punchline. But that's when the idea began to take shape. Not revenge out of rage, that's messy, impulsive, stupid. This would be surgical. I'd watched enough people ruin themselves by losing control. I wasn't going to be one of them. No. This had to hurt in the same way she hurt me, slowly, invisibly, completely. So I started building a new version of myself, one she wouldn't recognize. I joined a gym near my office. The kind of place where guys in their 20s stare in mirrors and grunt over weights they can barely lift. The first few weeks nearly broke me. But pain has a strange way of keeping you honest. When your body aches, your mind quiets. I stopped drinking, stopped eating the takeout shoe of. I cut out everything that made me weak. By the time she noticed, my shirts fit tighter, my shoulders squared. I looked different, stronger. While she said one morning, her tone cautious, "You've been working out, trying something new," I replied. Figured I needed a change. She smiled, but I saw it in her eyes, uncertainty. That's when I knew I had her attention again. Not because she cared, but because she was curious. Curious if she still had control. She didn't. At work, I started playing a different game too. I'd always been the quiet guy in the corner, the one who did his job and went home. But now I stayed later, spoke up in meetings, made people listen. My boss noticed. So did others. Promotion talk started floating around. Lauren didn't notice, not at first. She was too distracted with her secret texts and late-night work calls. But when she did, she tried to slip back into the version of herself she thought I wanted. The sweet wife, the one who asked how my day was, cooked dinner again. She laughed more, wore the same perfume she did when we first met. It was all performance. I played along, and she didn't realize that every word, every fake kiss, was ammunition for me later. The guy's name was Ryan Holt, 33, smooth talker, worked in sales at her firm. Divorced, with that kind of careless arrogance that only comes from people who've never had to face real consequences. I started following him. Not literally. I wasn't stupid, but digitally. His social media, his LinkedIn, even old college posts. I found out where he went on weekends, what bars he liked, who his friends were. He wasn't discreet. Most cheaters aren't. They think the world revolves around their secrecy, but really, they just build patterns, predictable ones. And I was watching. One night, I drove out to a bar they'd been to before, a place called the Lantern, downtown. I parked across the street, watched through the window. She was there, so was he, laughing, touching his arm, pretending no one in the world mattered. And for a brief moment, I wanted to walk in, throw a drink in his face, scream at her, break something, anything, but I didn't, because the plan wasn't ready yet. Instead, I memorized their faces, the way they looked at each other. That was fuel, not for anger, but for precision. The next morning, I sat at my computer, opened a blank document, and typed 3 words at the top. The plan begins. Under it, I started writing bullet points. Gain her trust again. Learn his weaknesses. Turn them against each other. Walk away clean. Every betrayal leaves fingerprints. I just needed to collect enough to destroy them, not physically, but socially, financially, emotionally. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance. I'd given everything, my time, my trust, my loyalty, and they'd stolen it. Now I was going to take something back, not with violence, not with threats, but with the kind of silence that haunts you forever. Because the worst kind of pain isn't the one that screams, it's the one that smiles while it watches you fall apart. Once you decide you're not going to yell, you learn a different kind of violence, the one that arrives in the shape of small, unavoidable things. I learned to think in days and inches, how to compress a year's worth of pain into a single season of consequences. I learned to be patient the way a predator learns to be patient, slow, deliberate, barely breathing. I kept my job. I kept my face. I kept my hands steady. Those were the things I could afford to keep. The rest I remade. At first, the moves were petty, leaving a calendar invite where she'd see it. switching a voicemail greeting to something awkward, letting a meeting email expire unanswered so she'd get a gentle reprimand from a client. That's the part you don't imagine when you picture revenge. It's not fireworks, it's paperwork. Bureaucracy has teeth. Small administrative pressures make confident people scramble, and people who rely on appearances hate scrambling more than anything. I also made sure I didn't burn bridges. I started showing up at work earlier, not as a show, but because showing up let me build credibility in a way she couldn't. My boss began to notice the difference. When you do the work quietly and well, people trust you. Trust is a currency I'd spent and then reclaimed. I used it to get access to things, not stolen, just rightfully earned under different name. Professionalism. Ryan was careless in the ways men like him always are. He played fast. Charm was his currency. That charm had never needed ballast. I watched how he smiled at women in the office, how he used humor to deflect, how he assumed tasks would always be papered over. He never imagined patterns. He never imagined plans. So I began to build patterns around him. I would not lay traps that required skillful law-breaking. I'm not a villain in a movie. I'm a man who was given a choice and chose to be methodical. My tools were simpler: timing, perception, and the social structures that govern careers and reputations. I started with his calendar. I hadn't hacked anything. I used the small available holes: a misaddressed memo he trusted a colleague to send and forgot, a forwarded invitation that lost an attachment. The errors were plausible. They were also contagious. A missed attachment could make a client question a report. A single omission gives a supervisor an opening to ask for verification. People in offices are quick to cover themselves, and when they do, the guilty are exposed in ways that feel bureaucratic rather than vicious. At home, I did something more intimate. I rebuilt our private rituals to serve as staging ground. I cooked food she used to like, played a playlist from the old days, made the bed the way she liked it. Those things were not kindness. They were theater. Her comfort would lower defenses. The easier life felt, the more reckless she could become. That's what I needed: a woman who believed her lies were working, who would not imagine the scaffold of those lies could be quietly removed. She started to trust me again in small ways. I became the person she confided in, the patient ear when an email went wrong, the steady voice when a client frowned. In the moment she asked me where something had been, I would inch toward a reaction that was the exact opposite of rage, a soft, disappointed hum that made her doubt herself more than my words could. Self-doubt is corrosive. It eats until people confess or make mistakes trying to cover the hole they feel, and mistakes are what I wanted. Small human errors leave fingerprints, not the forensic kind, but the kind the world reads as pattern. When her boss asked for receipts, the few that were missing were the ones that mattered: the hotel folios, the dinner invoices, the invoice number that didn't match a payment. Each one was a pebble in the river. Alone, none of them damned anything. Together, they threatened to flood a career. I also fed rumors in the soft places. The PTA group that once praised her was a gossip network as much as a volunteer committee. A carefully placed question from a concerned parent: "Didn't you say this donor was invoiced for X?" Might as well have been an internal memo. Nobody wanted the scandal. But the moment someone starts asking politely, others begin to check their own records. People who once toasted her success started preserving themselves. Ryan's world rotated differently. The first time his manager called him into a real conversation, not the blithe banter of social drinks but a precise, uncaring query about deliverables, his body language changed. Confidence curdled into anxiety. You can see the moment a man realizes performance is not enough, mouths part for excuses, and then clench at the sight of paper. That's when they start to look for allies. I let him look for me. "Oh man, it's a mess," he told me once, voice tight, as if trying to be confessional. "I've been slammed. Let me help," I said. That seemed to be his final mistake. By offering help, I put myself inside his space, close enough to close the door. I did help, in the precise way a surgeon helps by preparing the patient for an incision. I reviewed slides, clarified data, and then pointed out where his work looked thin to someone who hadn't lived in the project. A useful colleague, a savior even, until the next failure landed. People remember the pattern of someone who was there when the roof caved, and then absent when the roof needed shoring up. Ryan began to look unreliable because he had been relied on before and now couldn't deliver. At home things intensified. I started planting small artifacts of her guilt in public places. An email accidentally sent to a colleague that mentioned a retreat expense, a calendar invite that showed two check-ins at an unfamiliar boutique hotel. She blamed herself and then blamed chance. When you convince someone they are losing their grip on reality, they make irrational decisions, canceling dinners, calling clients at odd hours, sending panic messages. She sent one to Ryan in the wrong thread. He answered too quickly. That answer became a line I could quote. I didn't humiliate her in public. I constructed a private terror, the sense that any moment someone would step up with the ledger, and the world would agree with them. The anxiety of anticipation is worse than the event because it's constant. There were nights I wrestled with what I'd become. I'd lie awake and imagine my friends laughing over beers while we'd both been pretending, and think about the life we were supposed to have. That guilt flickered but never overwhelmed the logic of the plan. Because logic has company in the night. Proof. The folders on my hard drive were not trophies. They were contracts with a new self. The truth had weight. I intended to drop it. I thought about stopping more than once. A childish part of me hoped the exposure, if I ever revealed myself, would be an act of mercy. I imagined a dramatic confession where I stood in front of a room and said, I knew, I washed, I forgave you. In that fantasy there was healing. But fantasy is a tidy house. Truth is a bulldozer. The decisive move came not because I liked destroying other people's intimacy, but because the world had taught me the language of consequence. One afternoon, an email landed in a partner's inbox I had cultivated, a neutral note asking for clarification on a vendor payment. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The partner asked, the vendor produced a copy, and the copy didn't reconcile with anything in her file. The auditors did what auditors do. They asked more questions. One question becomes two. To become a request for records, when the first formal letter arrived, the clinical brand letterhead request for supporting documentation, I watched her face pale the way terrible weather turns leaves inside out. She called me. Her voice was small, the perfect surrender. Can you help me find these? She asked. I could have done the easy thing, produced the documents, and stopped the hemorrhage. Instead, I offered procedural guidance, where to look, how to respond, the names of the people who would help. My hand was invisible on the cocked gun. She made the call, she searched the drawers, she found the gaps. She slept badly. She drank her coffee bitter, and her hair lost its shine. The loneliness of exposure is a species of grief. It sharpens the senses until you become small enough to begin confessing. Meanwhile, Ryan's desperation grew clumsy. He postured on social media about commitment and hard work, but friends sent me screenshots of his late messages. The way he asked colleagues for favors he couldn't repay. His arrogance had blinded him to the slow erosion of trust. People began to hesitate around him. The market is unforgiving to a reputation that WOBBLES. In public, I remained the steady husband. At neighborhood cookouts, I laughed at jokes and grilled burgers. I took the kids to soccer. I mailed the PTA donation letter. In the quiet I read theirs messages, hotel itineraries, the tiny receipts of an affair that thought itself clever. The contrast made my work easier. People trust what they see. A man who looks intact is harder to accuse. The week the board asked for an internal review, the world narrowed to a single axis, proof or rumor. I walked into the meeting and handed over my file, not with gloating, but with the measured calm of a man who had been listening for a long time. The folder was clinical: dates, Emails, overlapping timestamps, receipts. Nothing dramatic, nothing salacious beyond the facts. Facts do their own violence when assembled. When the auditors called her into a preliminary meeting, I watched from the periphery as the face I loved imploded. She read statements, answered polite, probing questions, and smiled lamely when colleagues offered support. The world is kinder to people who perform contrition well, and crueler to those who can't. She learned to perform it. She learned too late that performance doesn't always get you out of a ledger. There are people who ask afterwards whether I enjoyed seeing them fall. They ask as if satisfaction were simple. There was a relief, yes, a grim, honest thing like a fever breaking. But it sat beside a different realization. I had become someone who could take pleasure in a slow dismantling. That was not a comforting thought. On the night before anything public happened, I went to the gym and lifted until my arms shook. Pain is honest. Exhaustion clears a mind. I sat in my car afterward and let my hands cool on the steering wheel. I had the noises of the day in my head, the quiet clicks of a printer, the whisper of turning pages, the soft sound of her voice saying, "I made a mistake." I let that sentence sit like a stone in my mouth and decided, finally, that I would no longer be the man who took being made for a fool. The next morning the paper came. The audit letter had moved into a new register. Formal interviews, counsel, official notifications. The dominoes I'd set, calendar errors, vendor questions, missed attachments, had become the architecture of accountability. It was not the blaze of a movie. It was the grinding machinery of institutions. Institutions do not care about melodrama. They care about records. Records do not forgive. When the first call arrived from her boss asking for clarification about invoices, she started to cry on the phone. I heard it through the line, and for a second, I felt like stepping forward to hold her. Then I remembered the line she'd sent in the shower months ago. "He's clueless. I'll be done with him soon." That had been the knife. This was the bleeding. That night, as the house grew quiet and the stars pricked the sky, I sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp on and the file open. I could have been a lesser man and ended it with a scene. I could have screamed, taken a baseball bat to the back door, and watched everything topple in painful, cinematic ruin. Instead, I closed the file, slid it into the drawer, and went to bed, because the destruction I'd engineered was not for spectacle. It was for balance, and balance, like any precise instrument, must be handled with unfeeling hands. The morning the letters arrived felt like the house inhaling at once and not exhaling. White envelopes, stamped, official, small, precise instruments of consequence that had nothing to do with shouting or tears. They belonged to a language people in suits spoke: request for records, notice of investigation, preliminary findings. Each one landed like a pebble dropped into the stillness. The circles widened and widened until you could no longer pretend the surface was unbroken. Lauren found the first one on the kitchen counter while the kids were at school. She turned it over like a fragile thing. "It's nothing," she said at first, though her voice had that brittle edge I'd heard before. I sat across from her at the table, the sunlight cutting bars through the blinds, and watched the color drain from her face. She read it again, slower. Her hand trembled the second time, fingers clutching the paper as if it could be folded into safety. "Who sent it?" she whispered. I said nothing. I didn't have to. The answer was in the folder I'd kept: dates, hotel folios, overlapping timestamps, expense reports that didn't reconcile with anything on the ledger. The truth doesn't beg or shout. It waits with a bureaucrat's patience. She called in sick that day. She canceled meetings, lied about stomach flu to colleagues she'd once texted in the middle of the night with laughs and silly emojis. It didn't help. The machinery I'd set rolling by asking the right questions and nudging the right people doesn't stop for apologies. It stops for facts. By the third day, whispers had a shape. A parent who'd usually comment on cupcakes stopped making eye contact at soccer practice. A woman from my son's class sent a text that read, "Is everything okay at your house?" Heard some things, thought maybe I should reach out. People try to be kind, but kindness in a small town often looks a lot like distance. I watched my daughter play in the grass, her ponytail bouncing, and felt a hollowness so big my ribs ached. It wasn't just the cost to me. It was the way the whole world of normal life, birthday parties, afternoon carpools, school plays started to feel like glass. The press smelled at necks. Local blogger pieces became regional breadcrumbs. Fundraiser under scrutiny, questions raised over expense reports. No names at first. Then a photo with a headline that wasn't technically false. Local event coordinator leaves board amid inquiry. Lauren's face was in the frame. Her features looked older than they were, stitched with exhaustion. I didn't go on television. That wasn't my point. The point had never been performance. It had been to take back control of my life in a way that meant something practical, to prevent her from continuing until she chose honesty, or until the world chose it for her. Ryan's collapse was quicker. He was younger, less careful, and he'd always traded on swagger. When a client asked why deliverables hadn't been met, he didn't have a real answer. He had excuses, then silence, then a resignation letter that smelled of panic rather than dignity. He called once an awkward, fumbling thing. "Ethan, man, I'm sorry." His voice was suddenly raw, empty of the greasy charm that had once allowed him to slide back into rooms and smile his way out of consequences. "You promised me you'd be careful," I said, not trying to sound like a judge or a savior, only a man who'd been hurt. He sounded like someone who had just been told you can only borrow time once. I know. And then, like a child, he tried to push the blame back at me. "You're doing this because you can't accept losing her," he muttered. It was an ugly thing to say. It was also a play for sympathy. I hung up. There was a moment of stupid longing to confront him in a parking lot, to let the old rage do something visible. But I'd learned carefully that fists are for moments. Consequences are forever. The first board meeting changed everything. People in the room spoke in neutral tones. Their faces were masks as the institutional calm, but their eyes searched for culpability. Lauren sat with her attorney like someone reading a foreign text in real time. She answered questions in measured, rehearsed tones. When asked about documentation for a particular vendor payment, she reached for a file and came up empty. The gap was raw. It gaped. Someone asked, politely and deliberately, "Are you certain that all reimbursements were properly authorized?" She swallowed. "Yes," she said, and for a breath, I almost believed it. Then a ledger called into the room like a bell. Paper has a way of being unmistakable. It doesn't bend to please. The board's face, the CEO's slow nod, the clerk's professional detachment, those were the instruments of the town's judgment. After the meeting, there were calls. Tough conversations. One of Lauren's closest friends, someone I'd shared holiday dinners with, texted me, "If she needs a place, my door is open." It was kind, but it was also a closing. People who open doors are also people who shut them down at night. The house sleeps differently after reputations crack. There's a tremor in the floorboards, a new emptiness. Lauren left the bedroom a few nights into the scandal and slept on the couch as if the distance would feel less like failure if she could make it physical. I would lie awake, watching her in the glow of the TV, noting the way her shoulders contracted with every notification. Sometimes, sleep took me in pockets, short, shallow bursts, and I'd wake up with a taste of guilt. Guilt arrived in unexpected forms. I found myself thinking about the vendor who lost a contract because I'd nudged a question their way. He had called his bank and had to explain why a payment lines up differently than expected. He'd had to lay off a worker he liked. One afternoon, his wife left a casserole at my doorstep. She didn't look at me. Her eyes said something. "You did this. I hope you're ready to live with it." I was. I told myself I was. But the human cost is not abstract. It weighs in small moments. The canceled piano lesson because Lauren could no longer afford the assistant she'd booked for after-school programs. The way a neighbor's invitation to a barbecue never made it across our lawn. Collateral is its own kind of cruelty. There were other costs, internal ones. Self-knowledge arrived in the quiet. I had not only orchestrated exposure, I had practiced deception in its own right. I'd become an author of pain, patient and precise. That realization sat in me like a splinter. The line between victim and architect blurred until some nights I thought I'd lost the map of who I was. Then, in the softest hour of one morning, the call came that shifted the axis again. It was from the police. Ryan had been found in a car at the edge of a bridge, doors locked, engine running. No note, the officer said. His phone was in the console. There was no sign of foul play at the scene. The mind jumps to terrible conclusions: suicide, a staged vanishing. I walked around the neighborhood in a daze, shoes crunching over frost, thinking about his wife's voice when she'd called me thin, brittle, repeating that she didn't know what to do. The world rearranged. The human consequence I'd started rippled outward and returned with a force I didn't expect. Grief. You can rationalize a lot. You can say people make choices. You can say everyone is responsible for their actions. But when a man's life ends in a motion that seems to close a door forever, the moral ledger becomes complicated. I'd wanted him to feel the cost of betraying me. I had not wanted him to be gone. Funerals are strange devices. They put us all in a line, side by side in our frailty. People came muted, careful, some to mourn for him, many to watch how the story unfolded. Lauren went with hollow, bleeding steps. She stood by at the gravesite and said, in a voice flattened by the weather, "I'm sorry." For what? I don't know him. Me herself. The apology was a pebble. It fell into an ocean of consequence and made a small, inevitable ripple. After the funeral, a man from Ryan's team called me and asked one blunt question. "Did you mean for this to happen?" His voice held accusation and a hunger for explanation. "No," I said. The word felt brittle in my mouth. It was true and not true. I had meant to inflict accountability, not death. The line is thin, and once crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. You expect that a moment like that will change you. Perhaps it did. I found myself standing in front of the mirror more than usual, watching a man I hardly recognized. He had become precise, patient, and undeniably dangerous, not because he wanted to be, but because the circumstances required it. The problem was that in the quiet after Ryan's death, filtering through grief and hollow victory, the world stopped asking whether any of this was moral. People were busy reassigning blame, signing contracts, planning PR damage control. The institutional noise moves quickly, and the individual reverberations are slow. For Lauren, everything accelerated and then slammed into an immovable wall. The company placed her on leave pending further investigation. Donors revised their commitments. Friends leaned away. She packed a bag one night and left for her sister's house across state lines, perhaps to escape the suffocating gaze. I watched her go and felt the old anger sharp and sensible dull into a heavier, quieter ache. The kids asked why Mommy wasn't home. I said the kind of thing I had practiced for nights. She needed some time away. It was all true in a way, but it was also evasive. There was one last act on my part before the end. I went to the office, and with hands that had once trembled over a message on a phone, placed every copy of the file I had compiled into the HR director's hands. I didn't demand anything then. I didn't watch what they did. I left as if that physical act closed a circle. Maybe it did. Maybe it was just another pebble. That night, I made dinner for the kids. We ate in a way that pretended everything was ordinary. My son talked about a goal he'd scored in soccer practice. My daughter sang a song off-key and entirely without shame. Their small normalities felt like a new kind of proof that even in this rubble, some structures can be rebuilt if you are willing to do the mundane, stubborn work. I slept poorly, easily startled awake by the slightest noise. Sometimes I'd wake and text Lauren something I didn't send. "Are you okay?" and then delete it. She had become untouchable. In the long cold hours, I tried to remember what had driven me to architect such a ruin. The memory was muddy. The text I hadn't meant to see, the small humiliation, the steady erosion of trust. I remembered the choices, and I remembered creating a new self that was narrow and efficient in purpose. The reckoning had happened, the world had adjudicated, institutions had acted, reputations had bent. But the deeper reckoning, the one that lives in quiet rooms and argues with your reflection, was ongoing. I had taken back something, respect, at the least, but I had traded pieces of myself to get it back. The ledger had balanced one way, but the human cost sat waiting on the other side. There's a line people rarely reach in stories about revenge, the point where you realize that having won was not the same as having yielded. I was standing at that line now, looking across to whatever came next. The final part of this was not about exposing or punishing. It was about choosing whether to keep cutting or to learn how to stitch. The question sat there in my chest, heavier than any victory. What comes after a life like this, after truth, after consequence, after the quiet of a house that had known too many lies? The air that came through the kitchen window in those early months tasted like winter and something older, regret. It sat in the house like dust, everywhere, unavoidable, thin enough to inhale without noticing until it scratched the throat. I learned that the world keeps moving even when your private life has disintegrated into sharp pieces. Mail still came. The kids still had homework. The milk still went sour if you left it too long. Ordinary things have a way of forcing you back into life. After Ryan's funeral, after the auditors closed files and the donors tightened their belts, a new kind of silence moved into the house. Lauren left for her sisters. She called sometimes, talked in clipped sentences about legal meetings and compulsory therapy. The kids asked questions, the simple, clean questions of children trying to make sense of grown-up weather. "Why is Mommy gone?" my son asked one morning, his face still wet from sleep. "Is she coming home?" My daughter drew a picture of a house with two doors, and when I asked why, she said, "So Mommy can go in and not scare us." Their words were windows into a world I'd been building for them. And for a moment, I felt everything I had done, and everything I could not undo. People's faces changed in small ways. Neighbors who'd waved now crossed the street. Friends returned polite texts only. At the grocery store, conversations shifted from easy chatter to awkward silence. Some people offered casseroles, others offered thin condolences, and a few didn't know at all what to say. The community had a memory like a manuscript. Sometimes it turned pages quickly. Sometimes it reread certain lines for comfort, for warning. I could feel that manuscript folding me into lines I hadn't expected to occupy. Legally, the world moved predictably. HR closed its investigation with findings that left Lauren's resume frayed. She lost a seat at the nonprofit board she loved. People who had been her allies issued statements about mistakes and lessons learned. I gave a deposition in a conference room that smelled of coffee and neutral paint. My voice came out steady. Practice makes even pain sound quotidian. The lawyers nodded, filed their folders. The machinery of consequence had done its job. Paper had teeth, but paper is not healing. The hardest reckonings were private and stubborn. At night I would lie awake and remember the first time I'd seen that text on her phone, the line about how he's clueless. The memory is a small thing, a bright pinprick that gives way to the broader map. The months I spent building a careful counterwound. The choices I made that were legal but brutal in consequence. The man who was gone, his wife's voice cracking as she asked for help. The vendor with a closed shop. The intern who lost a promotion. My ledger balanced, but each entry was a real life in the columns. I tried to allow myself plain language. I didn't intend for Ryan to die. I did intend for there to be consequences. I wanted truth to matter, but intention doesn't remove result. That's how responsibility multiplies. It was easy to tell the story where I was a victim and hero in one breath. It was far harder to speak the truth where I was both victim and architect. Accepting that both could be true was the slow work of waking up. The kids needed me in ways that had nothing to do with grand gestures. They needed lunches made, and science projects taped, and someone to listen to their small catastrophes at bedtime. Doing that work felt like an act of atonement and of survival. My hands learned new habits, tying shoelaces that should have been mine to teach calmly, making peanut butter sandwiches without thinking about palms and fists, sitting through a cartoon episode without looking at my phone. There's a discipline in presence that's different from discipline in planning. Presence is low-grade heroism, boring, repetitive, and patient. Therapy helped, not the hot, cathartic scenes of confession on a stage, but the patient work of noticing patterns, of learning to name the dark and set it down. I told a therapist I was ashamed of being proud of the plan, proud of the cleverness I'd used to hurt people who hurt me. He didn't judge. He helped me inventory what I'd learned and what I needed to rebuild. People break things, he said once, and then they either learn how to fix them or they build new lives on the broken pieces. The phrase felt like a map. One path toward repair, another toward building a new structure that does not pretend the old one never existed. I had to answer practical questions too. Custody arrangements, school pickups, financial logistics. Lauren and I negotiated through lawyers at first, then with clumsy directness how the kids would split their time. There was a long list: holidays, medical appointments, extracurriculars. For them, stability was a home repair project, not a morality play. We learned to coordinate calendars like choreographers of a fragile ballet, not lovers coordinating gestures. Sometimes forgiveness arrived without permission. Once, my daughter found an old photo album and leafed through pages that had pictures of all of us on better days. She handed me a photograph of our family at the beach, sand in our hair, sun in our smiles, and said, "I like this one." Her small, simple judgment cut through a lot of debate in my head. What I had to give them now was safety and availability, not explanations. That meant the quotidian labor of fatherhood became sacred. I tried to be honest with the kids in age-appropriate ways. Mommy made an adult mistake, I told them once, feeling the words like the first step across a frozen pond. And some grown-ups made choices that hurt other grown-ups. But you're loved. We're going to take care of you. They accepted it with the resilience of young hearts. They moved on to play with Legos as if the human weather didn't last forever. Their capacity to forgive without ceremony shamed me. There were days when rage returned, a sharp, hot visitor, and I had to keep it on a leash. When a neighbor said something cruel about what I'd done on the basis of rumor, my first reaction was to answer in venom. But I learned to slow down. Not because I'd suddenly become saintly, but because revenge never built a life. It only extended the burning. Each time I swallowed that urge, I reinforced a muscle. Control, now used to hold myself together rather than to pull others apart. Time did its usual merciless, mundane work. Wounds crusted and sometimes healed. People who used to be friends drifted away and some drifted back. The PTA invites returned, sparsely at first, then more openly. A neighbor who'd been careful around me started asking about carpools again. It wasn't big, cinematic redemption. It was small, like a pencil mark on a calendar that reads, "Already better today." Lauren returned to town months later. She has her own path, complicated and hard. We are not the couple we were. We are parents who wake early and trade texts about medicine dosages and science projects. We have a language now that is mostly logistics and solemn commitments. Do not call the children's school unless it's an emergency. Show up for recitals. Be civil at pickups. It's not warmth, it's work. But work can be transforming, not because it erases the past but because it carves out predictable spaces for a future. I kept changing small things about myself. I learned to cook dinners that weren't takeout. I replaced the old cheap watch I once wore with a simpler one that fit better on a wrist that now carried more. I went to the gym not to build muscles for intimidation, but to stay steady through days that required strength. I volunteered to coach my son's soccer team, not for recognition, but because coaching demanded patience in the small, humiliating ways. I needed to learn patience. There were nights I thought I'd made a mistake of moral magnitude, nights where Ryan's face floated up in memory, and I imagined different choices. I wrote letters once, private things to nobody, where I tried to trace moments back and understand the exact second that had broken me. Writing helped not to absolve, but to notice. I started with anger and ended with an inventory. The man I'd been, the man I became, what I had gained and what I had lost. But in the end, the most important lesson came not from law or logic, but from a small, noisy thing. My child laughing at a silly movie and throwing popcorn at my face? It's a trivial image, but it's full of redemption. There's a stubborn kind of grace in the ordinary that revenge never tills. The work of being present, the sandwiches, the soccer practices, the emergency dentist appointments, they became my tasks and my repair. If you ask me whether I would do it all again, I won't lie. Sometimes I want the old certainty back, and I would not go back to being the man who was played and humiliated without response. But I also would not choose the exact path I took. There are ways to hold people accountable that do not lay waste to lives you will have to live with afterwards. There are better balances between justice and cruelty. On a winter morning a year after it all began, I found an old receipt from a diner we used to go to stacked under cookbook. Lauren had left it there, a scribbled note on the back that said, "Remember when?" It was small and insignificant, and maybe it was nothing. I kept it anyway. Proof that memory is not only ruins. I kept that paper in a showbox with other small things. My son's first tooth, a ticket stub to a movie where our daughter fell asleep on my shoulder, a receipt from a hardware store when I'd fixed the fence myself. They are odd artifacts of a life that continues in spite of everything. They are not trophies of triumph, but talismans of continuity. Revenge gave me an answer to a particular question: who gets punished when we break vows? But it didn't teach me how to live afterward. The work of staying, of being steady and available to those who depend on you, that's the real measure. It's quieter than headlines and harder than plans. It is also kinder. I don't know if I am transformed in the way some heroes of stories are, by noble revelations and dramatic endings. I am simply different, maybe better in some ways, worse in others. What I am sure of is this: the cost of rebuilding is ongoing, and the thing that saves you from becoming the person you despise is not the cleverness of your plans, but the humility of your mornings. So, I make lunches. I tie shoelaces. I go to practice. I let my daughter spill her glue on the table and laugh with her while we tidy the mess. I let my son yell when he scores, and I lift him high in the air even when the noise around us is quiet. There is no final scene where everything is perfect. There's only the daily work, the small, ordinary acts, and in them perhaps a kind of quiet redemption.